I thought that either I could change the environment or how I would feel about it would change, or people would change.
Welcome to the In-Between, a space for anyone navigating from the familiar to the unknown. Whether you're facing a personal, professional, or spiritual disruption, these conversations are here to help guide you through the questions, uncertainties, and opportunities that come with change. Hear from leaders, thinkers, and storytellers who found their way forward, and learn how you can too. No matter where you're starting, you don't have to navigate this alone. Change can feel like stepping into uncharted waters, full of uncertainty, self-reflection, and the search for purpose and meaning. Collin Mayjack knows this journey intimately, not just from his own experience transitioning as a pastor into a career in product marketing, but also from the space that he's created for stories to be shared as the host of the Holy Shift podcast. Today, we'll chat about Collin's own experience, the insights he's gleaned from his guests, and what it means to navigate the in-between with more clarity. If you're in a season of uncertainty, wondering what's next, I believe this conversation can help you. So, Collin, thank you for being on this podcast. And I just want to say right off the rip, I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversations that you're hosting on Holy Shift, and so happy to have you here.
Thanks, man. Yeah, it means a lot that you've listened. Thank you for taking the time to invite me. We were just talking about how I haven't been on this side of the podcast mic for a while. So yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, you've spent time navigating your own season of transition, and you've heard a lot of other people's stories too. So for those who may not be as familiar with your background, maybe they haven't had the chance to check out the podcast, can you take us back to your days in leadership? What did it look like back then for you?
Yeah, I'll give a little context. So I grew up as young as 12, 13, knowing that I wanted to be a pastor in a church. And there's a lot of reasons for that complicated blend of being raised by a single mom and my own kind of search for meaning, and youth pastors being father figures, and maybe some sense of calling, depending on what you believe about God. But by 13 or 14, knew, hey, I really want to be a pastor. And so I threw myself headlong into all things church volunteering at that, even throughout high school. Like I've joked that I didn't play a sport. I played youth group. Like that was the thing I did. And so I threw myself into that. Went to college and got a degree in Bible and theology with a hope to eventually church plant. So if you're not familiar with that term, there's starting a new church from scratch. That was the vision. I was very entrepreneurial, always have been, and we can come back to that later. But moved to Portland, Oregon, and started working at a church up there and became what's called their pastor of communities. So I would help get people involved in the church and then get them connected with groups of 8 to 12 other people who live in their neighborhood so they can meet every single week and have a meal and talk about faith and try to figure out this whole church and community thing together. I had a complicated transition out of ministry, which we'll talk about in a minute, but that was the role that I was in most recently. Did that for a number of years in Portland, was on the teaching team, so I get to teach from time to time. But all of that was with the future plan to eventually church plant, was kind of where I was headed.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. So one of the things you mentioned, and to the extent that you're comfortable sharing, you had mentioned growing up in a fatherless home or without a father. I grew up without a father too. My dad passed away when I was a young kid, so I grew up without a father as well. So could you share a little, what did that look like for you? And then maybe the second part of that question is, you had mentioned how that might have impacted some of your decisions or the influence that other people had in your life. Could you talk about that a little more?
Yeah. So to give some context, my parents were not married when my mom got pregnant. And once it started to become clear that my mom was going to have a child, that was not something my dad was super interested in. And so for the first 5 years of my life, I was raised by my mom and my grandmother. And then around age 5 is when I started seeing my dad on a semi-regular basis. By that meaning once maybe twice a month for a few hours. And so the better part of my kind of developmental years was in the context of being raised by a single mom and living with my mom and my grandparents. So never having that kind of male figure in the home. I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, but there is just something irreplaceable about a proper dad.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no switching that. And my dad, the older I've gotten, I've kind of started to see the way my dad wrestled with his own demons. My dad's a longtime alcoholic, and I think in a lot of ways wasn't able to be a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Like just did not. And that's the generous interpretation. I have my days where I'm angry, but I think really just had enough pain and had enough difficulty that just wasn't in him. Like he didn't have it to give away to be a parent. And so I then really found it kind of filled that hole subconsciously by going to youth groups. And so I would go to youth groups and I would find myself spending, sure, time with the other students in the youth group, but I latched really closely onto these young youth pastors who are, I mean, I'm probably anywhere from 11 up to 18. And they're typically guys who are in their late 20s, early 30s, not quite dad age, but kind of indistinguishable. And I just found myself pulled to them. And I think they knew, all right, Colin doesn't have a dad in his life. And then invested in me. It's like I would show up early. We would go grab dinner before youth group would start. I found myself really heavily leaning on their guidance. And I think the byproduct of that is, I mean, part of what a dad's supposed to do is give you a roadmap for who you're to become, whether you're a man or a woman. Just there's kind of this calling out of a destiny, a calling. That's kind of what a dad, and giving you the sense of confidence of who you could become. Mm-hmm. And I think because that was youth pastors, that was my prototype. Mm-hmm. Like this is what men look like. They're pastors. And again, not all of this is at the subconscious level.
Sure.
But I think because that they so shaped my vision of being a man, it felt like it was the logical thing for me to be a youth pastor. Sure. So yeah, that's sort of how it shaped me and the trajectory it put me on.
No, yeah, and good on you for like being able to articulate that and come to some of those conclusions. I mean, I think there's some people that could live their whole lives without connecting those dots and just like remain like as obvious as it sounds, and somehow in some ways like there are things in our life that we just don't see. And some of that is because maybe we don't ever take the time to like look into it or explore or try to connect the dots. We just keep on moving. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Well, I think it takes, I mean, a lot of hours of therapy for me. I spent a lot of time in therapy. But I also do think for me, I don't know if I was capable of recognizing that in the context of ministry. Partially because it's like a data point that doesn't fit the narrative. Like if the narrative is God has called you to this, and this is a calling that has been born out of this kind of vision God has for your life, to draw out this thread of like, well, how much of this was animated by you don't have a dad? It kind of it cuts against that narrative. It's not that they're incompatible. I'm not saying that you can't believe both. But I think for me, getting out of ministry then gave me this ability to say, all right, what pushed me there? Like, why was I ever doing this? And kind of open that door to say, all right, it's not the only ingredient, but my own fatherlessness was a significant factor for Pastor Colin becoming a thing.
Yeah. I started seeing a counselor like 2.5 years ago or so. And like, yeah, when I'm like stuck on something, not that we don't work through it or connect other dots, but a lot of time the reminder is, hey, it all goes back to some of these earlier things that we've identified, one being the loss of your dad. So totally get that. So, and I appreciate you going there. So at some point you decided it was time to make a change. What was that internal wrestling like? What did it feel like? How did you start the process? Like, okay, if I'm not going to be this, if I'm not going to be a pastor, how did you wrestle with that, and what did that feel like?
I think for me, long before there was a decision of I'm not going to be a pastor, there was a lot of factors pulling me away from it that I was in denial of. So, I mean, one of the big things that pushed me out of ministry was the environment we were in was just a really painful environment for my wife. Um, from some ways she'd been really hurt by the leadership there, and I think some ways where the leadership was really unhealthy, and not a great environment for women. But I feel like for so long I ignored all the signs that this wasn't working because it was such like a dream that was so tied to my identity. Like this is who I am. I mean, as young as 12, feeling like I'm going to be on this pastor trajectory. It is almost like I didn't know with clarity it was time to leave until the pain became so unbearable of that dissonance of like, this is the dream I have, but the environment is so painful until that hit a point where like, I can't take this anymore. That's when the door actually opened of like, oh, it's time to leave.
Hey friends, I want to pause just for a moment. If you're navigating the complex and emotional process of leaving a mission-driven role, whether that's been ministry, nonprofit work, or any purpose-driven career, you're not just looking for a new job. You're wrestling with things like the personal, professional, and spiritual dynamics that come with all of this. Maybe you're asking things like, who am I outside of this role? What skills do I even have that can translate into the future? Will I ever find work that feels meaningful again? If this is resonating, download Finding Your Way to Flourishing. It's a free guide that I've put together for mission-driven leaders who find themselves in the midst of transition. This isn't just another guide, it's a thoughtfully crafted resource that's designed to help you begin processing your identity beyond the role that you're leaving. It can help you pinpoint which skills you can confidently bring into your new and next role. It'll help you lean into your faith and find peace during the midst of this uncertainty. It's not overwhelming, it's not complicated. It's just the first step to getting some clarity and moving forward. You don't have to figure this all out alone, and I'd love to walk this journey with you. This guide is completely free, and you can grab your copy today by clicking the link in the description or in the show notes. Let's start making some sense of this transition together. Okay, now back to the conversation.
I think for me, I wish I could say it was meditated and I thought through, but I feel like I held on to staying in that world like tooth and nail, trying to fight to keep that path and kind of stay in ministry. But it got to the point where I was put in a spot where there was this person who had really hurt my wife who was being made my boss. And I raised some problems and they said, hey, well, either A, you embrace this person as your boss and we move on, sweep all this under the rug, or you resign. There's your choice. And so I chose to resign. And at that time, I thought I was going to find another ministry job. Like, so for months, I just swirled of like applying for other jobs. And we went to San Diego. We talked to churches in Denver. We thought about church planting with no resources because I was so tightly holding on to, this is the dream. This is who I am. This is what I have to do. And it wasn't until months of that and going through another process of interviewing where we were sitting down and being interviewed and we were asked to rehash the reason we left. And I could just sense all this anxiety like in my shoulders and neck. Like I was having like a low-grade panic attack. And after that interview, my wife and I were like, we can't do this. Like I just need a job that isn't ministry. And so I wish I could say it was super thoughtful and clear of mind, but doing ministry had such a deep grip on me. And that was such a core anchor of my identity that I didn't let it go until everything in my body was telling me that I had to.
One of the things you mentioned was there were like signs, and you don't have to go into necessarily like specific details. I'm just thinking of the person that they're feeling this sort of tension of, do I stay? Do I go? I'm not sure what's next. I just feel like something might be changing or shifting. Like, were there signs, or you mentioned there were things pulling or pushing you away or pulling you towards something different. Like, are there signs that people could identify earlier,
Hmm.
as opposed to it getting to the point where it's like, no, my body's shutting down and I have to just do what it's telling instead? Like, are there more proactive things or signs you could have paid more attention to?
Yeah, not not a bulletproof list by any
Mhm.
means, but I think about the ones that were in my experience, and there were a few. One was looking at my relationship, and specifically my relationship with my wife. Was my partner thriving in this environment? And the answer was without a doubt, no. Like, it was so obvious. And so a lot of times I think if you're lucky to have a partner, like your spouse can be this mirror into whether what you're doing is actually working for you. Uh, and it was so obvious that it was having a negative impact on her. The lifestyle that came with being in ministry was so obviously impacting her, but it was not a sign I was like able to fully feel. Um, Another one is the feeling of this should be great. Why isn't it? It's almost like you have this because it's showing that like the reality and the vision are not matching up. It's like I had this vision of like I have this dream job on paper at this church that had a bunch of had a big reputation, a lot of podcast reach. Getting to teach there felt like a dream, and it had these really high highs. Like, I'm not going to deny it's not there were no highs, but then there were also these deep lows of like I just kind of feel low grade melancholy. I'm not the staff is not happy. Like, we don't play and we don't joke at the level that we should, and there's the senior leadership can come into the room and just suck all the energy out of the room, and it's this dissonance of like, on one hand this should be great, like that's for me that's the trigger in the past when you're like, if you feel like it should be great but it just isn't great. Like, there's a problem here. You need to listen to that thing that you've ignored. And so I think those are two of the signs that for me I just was kind of flying past for a lot of years. And I think there's probably the third one would be, can you be, and it's closely related, is how honest do you feel like you can be with what you feel and think? And I think for me, this was a relatively conservative Christian environment. And I don't have a problem with wherever you land on like theology. But for me, I had this intense feeling that I needed to be very calculated in what I believed, said, acted. I mean, another way to put it is like, does it just feel like it's hard all the time managing what's required to be in that environment? It's like, for me, I just felt like there was so much effort into, and I think if you're having to do something that just requires tremendous effort all the time, I'm all for effort. Like, I work hard in my job. But if effort is constant, that's a sign that you're probably not supposed to be there. Like, some things should come easy. And so I know those are a bit abstract, but I think like that partner mirror,
Mm-hmm.
that feeling of dissonance of like this should be great, but it's not. And then that intense feeling that you're just constantly having to manage your behavior or manage what you think or feel to fit and accommodate yourself for that space. Like, those were all the signs that, again, easier to critique and analyze when I'm out of it, but like were absolutely present in it.
No, I hope people like wrote those down or take time to think on those. Those are three like super helpful um indicators. Even if just one of those is like the alarm is like,
Yeah.
each one of those is strong enough to like, you don't even need two out of the three or three out of the three. Each one of those is strong
Yes.
enough to where it's like, okay, I need to push pause. Can this be fixed? Can adjustments be made? I think sometimes too, it's easy to think like, well, I can be the catalyst for change. Like I can,
Yeah.
and it's like, sometimes you're just up against way
Yeah.
more than what you're going to be able to change. And even if you could, most times it's not going to be, you know, things don't change overnight. It's not like a light switch you just flip on and off.
Yeah.
At best, you're looking at months or years
Yeah.
for things to possibly change. So those are great call outs, Colin.
Oh, I think you're right on the whole change thing. I think for me, I thought that either I could change the environment or how I would feel about it would change or people would change. And I think this is going to sound jaded, but I think people can change. They do not often change. And in order for a system to change, someone has to have the power to change it. And most time, like, unless you're quote unquote like the top person at whether it's a company or a church or whatever, change has to come from the top. And if you're not that person, you probably can't enact as much change as you'd want. Like, and I think, I know that sounds jaded. I hope it lands more so as just realistic.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I wrestled with for so long is, what do I need to change? Why? And finally, and this was after I had stepped away from doing what I was doing. You know, I made a big shift in 2020 where I had been a pastor for 18 years and decided to step out of that world. And it wasn't
Yeah.
even at the time where it was a couple years later. I was still trying to, like, what do I need to change to make this okay? And finally I just came to the realization, like, maybe I can be okay and not have to change anything
Yeah.
for that to work.
Yeah.
But that's not easy. That's hard.
Yeah.
Go
I
ahead.
think that's a huge deal. I think for me, I held that dream so tightly. And I think, I don't know, in the stream I was in, Christianity can sometimes endorse this idea that something is wrong with you. And so you do need to change yourself. And I'm not saying like I have my faults. You can ask my spouse about them, you ask my kids about them. I'm not saying like no moral responsibility. But there are some, like, not everything in you that doesn't fit in an environment or system is then something that like should be changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
No.
it shouldn't. I think we're, at least I'll speak from my experience. I was so hardwired to think that a lot of my impulses or desires are things that should be fought or challenged rather than things that should just be accepted and included as part of who I am.
And sometimes, exactly, it's just part of who you are, part of how you operate. Sometimes it's just a difference in values. You just value different things. And I don't even mean like on a moral level or like even just like how you operate, how you function. Sometimes it's just a matter of values. And but when there's not alignment in values, man, you're going to have there's not going to be a blending or a meshing. They're going to continue to like grind against each other.
Yeah.
So, you know, now that you're in this new chapter of your life, how are you thinking of, you know, when we throw around the word calling or use that word calling, you know, how are you looking at that word now? How are you viewing your relationship between your faith, your work, calling? How do you think about that nowadays?
I'm very much still working it out. But if I had to summarize it, I think my vision of calling has just shrunk down a lot. I think, particularly as someone who wanted to be a pastor, but I also think this is like a millennial thing. Like, we're very much fed this narrative that you're going to change the world, and everything had to be very grand and very, like, your reach needed to be really grand. And then I think the church version of that was you're going to you change a whole city for Jesus, or you plant this church that has this big echo in the neighborhood or in the county or in the state, or you reach thousands of people. Like, or even if it's not big in numbers, it's big in depth. Like, oh, someone's life is going to change because of what you're doing. And I think the older I've gotten, the more I've started to feel like calling is not that grandiose, but often it's the smaller and up close things that I'm most called to. Or maybe another way to put it is your life and the factors that are in it is your calling today. So like for me, and that's to say that calling is not permanent. It's like right now, when I think about my calling, I think about my wife, Maddie. I think about my son, James, and my daughter, Frances. And I think about the small community of friends that we have. And all of the responsibilities that support and orbit around that are in the scope of like calling. Um, and not, and it doesn't have to carry this intense weight. It's just like right now I'm called to be a parent to two young kids, to be a good husband and partner, to do a job that provides for that environment. And it's just not as grandiose. Like it doesn't feel as inspiring to read a book about that. It doesn't feel it makes me a little bit less of a main character in any way. But I think when I think about the things I'm called to, it's like if the scope was this big, wide idea of calling, it's just shrunk down a lot. Um, and I guess when I think about calling not being permanent, I also think about no one area of your life holding the full weight of that calling. So like I think of my work as a tool for part of my calling, but like I can pivot out of product marketing tomorrow, and that's fine. I think a lot of times when you can't imagine calling or purpose outside of a job, that's a sign that it's become too much. And I think I would have told you intellectually, like, yeah, of course, like I can have a calling in life outside of ministry. But the actual emotional realities, I held such a tight grip around it that I did not see any sense of identity or calling being possible outside of it. But yeah, shrinking it down in the non-permanence and calling being dictated by like what's literally right in front of your face. In this case, my small family and the job to support them in our friendship. That's kind of how I'm thinking about calling these days.
Oh, I love that dynamic, actually. The fact that you can think of it in a shrunk down version. But, if you were to turn the tables, if you can't think of calling outside of any other role that you're currently in, that seems very limiting to me. Like
Yeah.
that's one way that I've kind of talked about it, is like when I realized that I could untether myself from some of the things that I had remained very attached to, like title, calling, roles, positions, those types of things. When I realized I could completely change all of that and find purpose and meaning in things that were completely different, and it didn't affect how my relationship with God, in the sense that like it's not like I became less than, or when I was thinking about making a decision to change things up, I just had this sense that God was saying, well, do you want to do this or do you want to do that? Because whichever way you go, I'm going to be with you.
Mm.
And it's hard for us to imagine that when we do hold so tightly or can't see purpose or calling outside of any other role than the one we're currently, residing in.
Yeah.
So through hosting the Holy Shift podcast, you've heard a lot of stories of transition. Are there any common threads or struggles that seem to surface for people that are in that kind of space?
Oh man. There are certainly a lot of patterns. Yeah. So for context, I sit down with primarily ex-pastors and ministry leaders who are have left ministry and now built a career from scratch. And we talk about that transition. And I think at the fundamental level, most people who are in ministry, it's such a lifestyle job that leaving it feels like a death for most of them. There's parts of like there's maybe some life on the other side, and I fully agree that there's life on the other side of ministry, but you don't get to get a little bit preachy for a second, you don't get that resurrection without some death. And I think most of them, the loss of community, the loss of identity, the isolation, the misunderstanding, all of these things feel like a type of like death. And there's a non-linear grief that follows it that I think unless you've gone through it, you don't really get it. Like I think when the first time, I don't know, I remember the first time my buddy compared it, leaving ministry to a death. And I had basically felt that, but it felt melodramatic to say it. But when someone validated it, I was like, oh my God, yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Like I feel like someone died. And a lot of times that someone, depending on your experience of it, is either you feel like your vision of God died, or you feel like you died because your sense of self is so wrapped up in pastoring. It really is a unique career in that regard, because the reason it feels like such a death is because there's no separation in a lot of your spheres of your life. You take a normal job, for example, and you have your work, and then you have friends who are outside of work, and you might have a spiritual community that is outside of work, and you take all these things and they're completely separate. Whereas in church, your faith community and your friends and your boss and where you get your income and where you practice your faith and your sense of calling are all wrapped up in one thing. So when it goes really well, the highs are so high. But when it comes crashing down, that weight is so much more intense. Like if I get laid off tomorrow, it's a bummer, but it's not my whole life anymore. Versus if you have to leave ministry, it feels like this whole thing's going under. And so I think in the process of leaving, like that's the main fundamental hurdle, is this feeling of like it's a death. And then there's this whole other arm, because most people don't plan to ever leave ministry. Like it's very much a lifestyle job that you plan to stay in for the long haul. There's this one, they have no plan for what job they would do outside of it. And then two, it's such a hard experience to explain that actually translating that experience for someone to understand it is super hard. It's like finding a job once you've chosen to leave ministry. Most of the time, these are really qualified people who could kill it in work environments. They just don't have the experience, because like even the American church model basically puts you on a pipeline where you graduate high school, you probably volunteered in youth group, you go to college, maybe you get a Bible degree, and then you land like a youth pastor job at 21, and you get no real work experience outside of this thing. And so then coming out the other side, trying to explain like, well, I led small groups. Like, what does that even mean? And how can you do sales if you led a small group? So those are the two halves. There's a lot of sub pains and problems in it. But I think the fundamental one of like feeling like a loss of identity and the death that's there, and then this whole struggle of like, all right, how do I rebuild a career, find a new job, figure out what I'm good at, and actually get that job?
Yeah, no, you pretty much just described like the trajectory of my graduating high school and then the early part of adulthood for me. So, and you're right. For the most part, I think now there are people that are serving, leading in church spaces where they need some work ethic and they need to like develop some skills, but
Oh, for sure. I know. Yeah, to be clear, I've worked with people in ministry who would get eaten alive in a corporate job where there's measurables.
yes,
Sorry, I cut you
measurables.
off.
No, no,
Continue.
no, 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 no. But where I'm going is, for the most part, people are like way more skilled than they realize, and man, you're way more capable of pivoting and changing than you probably realize. You just have to start doing some things to connect those dots. And I'm wondering,
Yeah.
are there any mindsets that maybe you've also identified that some of your guests have talked about or experienced that maybe kept them in the early days of their transition from doing the work to connect their dots? Did they hold certain beliefs or mindsets that were preventing them from moving forward?
Yeah, on the job hunting side, I could think of a few, and they seem incompatible, but they simultaneously end up being in a lot of pastors. One is this feeling of I am not qualified and can't do anything outside of ministry, and at the same time feeling like what I did in ministry was so important. And there's elements of truth, but also like if you believe you can't do anything outside of ministry, you just won't put yourself out there. You won't like niche down and go hard after a job, and that will stop you from getting something. On the other hand, though, if you don't have the humility to know, like, hey, yeah, what you did in ministry was important, that doesn't mean you know anything about tech. Or you don't know, yeah, okay, you're good with people, but you've never taken a product to market, or you've never been a marketer, or you never and you need a simultaneous, basically what's needed is simultaneous humility of I don't know a damn thing, and confidence I can learn the things that are required to actually excel in a job. And the raw materials are there. It's just learning the skills. And I think for me, I remember when I left ministry feeling like I genuinely did not think anyone would ever want to hire me for something outside of ministry. It's I would say things like, what am I even good at if not doing this thing? And so that was a shift. And then also, again, because I came from a church that had some recognition, I thought oh, this should be important. And then, it doesn't, no one cares.
Yeah, no, that is fantastic. Holding the two in check, humility and confidence. I mean, I think that's how you learn. I think that's how you grow.
Yeah.
You have to be holding both of those and balancing that tension of I have so much that I don't know and so much that I can learn, and I know that I'm capable of learning and acquiring new skills and sharpening and developing my skills. So my heart just always goes to people that feel like they can't. And I think part of that is because for a long time in my life, I didn't feel like I was very capable or smart or fill in the blanks. And the moment you give yourself a little confidence to actually start trying some things and you start stacking some of those skills, man, it doesn't just add, it multiplies your confidence. I mean, for you to be, how far out of, or 4 years out of ministry? When did you?
Coming up on 4 years. Yeah.
4 years out of ministry. Product. I work for a software company, so I know what product marketing is now. I didn't really know what product marketing was when I really started working for them.
Yeah.
But I have a better understanding of what it is now. But for you to be able to say, yeah, if things shifted tomorrow, it's not like your whole world would come crashing down, because you've done some work to understand and realize, no, I've got some things that I can put back to use to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
So I want that for people as well. So
yeah,
I'm curious. I've got a couple other questions that I want to ask you, but are there parts of your story, with you always being the one asking the questions and being the host, are there parts of your story that you would want to share more about? Anything you're like, man, I just haven't had the space or the opportunity to speak on this aspect of my story, but I think it could be helpful to people.
There are plenty, and some of them I've kept close to the chest because I don't want to. As the host, you have this ability where you can shape people's perception of like this is the one path or the way to feel this. And I've tried to create space for knowing that yes, there's a lot of common experiences for people who leave ministry. There's also a lot where people vary in terms of how they relate to faith and church and work afterwards. But one I feel like I don't get to talk about, and it ties to what you were just describing, is being a couple years removed from ministry and rebuilding a career from scratch. I don't talk about this a lot, but I feel like a lot of pride in a good way of like, I feel proud of the fact that, all right, left ministry, no real plan. And I've gotten to a place where I feel like I'm respected by my colleagues. I'm at a spot where I'm not quote unquote, I don't feel as quote unquote behind anymore. I feel like when I left ministry, when your whole world is in this area that is not immediately transferable to other jobs, you feel like you're just behind. And I think I feel this sense of like just proud of myself that I've been able to rebuild the career and I've been able to advance really fast and I've been able to learn a lot about tech and product marketing and the stuff that years ago, if you said like, all right, Colin, you're going to be a product marketing manager at a B2B SaaS company, I would say, what does any of that mean? But I actually think the reason I share that is, I think just to say two things. One, you can get to that spot if you're transitioning, regardless of the career, that you can start over and pretty quickly get to a place where you feel proud of where you're at. And it's not like you're permanently behind because you invested in one path and then had to pivot to another path. And then that two, once you have done that, there's kind of a sense of feeling a little less easily shakable. Like I've mentioned a couple times, like if I had to pivot out of product marketing tomorrow, I think I could rebuild another career. Like I've done it. Like I think I could do it. And a couple of years ago, that idea scared the hell out of me. Like, if I just gotten this job and I felt like, all right, this is my one shot because it was already a fat chance. And now I'm like, all right, it's not really a fat chance. Like there's a skill required for finding a job. And then there's a skill required to research and learn and get good at something new. And people can learn that. And you can get to a place where you're proud of the ways you've advanced and rebuilt and been adaptable. So I haven't talked about that a lot because partially it feels, it could come off arrogant. And I hope it doesn't. But feeling a real sense of pride of rebuilding a career and how far I've gotten in what is grand scheme a short amount of time.
No, I love that. Happy for you. That's amazing.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. So for those listening who might feel stuck, they're just trying to keep their head above water, they're unsure about what's next. What advice, what encouragement, what's one or two things you would throw their way?
At the risk of giving a platitude, I think I would want to remind you that you're never actually stuck. There, at least as it comes down to career, like there are times where like a medical diagnosis comes in, that's going to change your life. It's going to limit it. Like child is born, that's going to change your life. It's going to limit it. But there is a huge range of your life that remains open to option and to change. And career, 9 times out of 10, is one of those things. And I think that knowing that, and then secondly, I think the thing that I felt for a really long time was there was two feelings. There was one, that belief of I don't think I could get a job outside of ministry. But then the one that followed really closely behind is that if I ever did, I would never be fulfilled in it. And I'm at a spot now where I genuinely enjoy my job. Like I like what I do. Again, it's not the same highs and but it's also not the same lows. Like I'm not like, it's almost like I think about how an equalizer when you're mixing audio is trying to keep the volume from peaking too high or bottoming out too low. And it's kind of trying to keep everything in a range. And I think now work stays in this range, but a lot of times it's pretty positive. And so I think I would want to remind folks that, hey, if you're feeling stuck, that there is much more in your life that is able to be changed than you think. And career is almost certainly one of them. And then if you do change a career and you leave behind something that feels like it's part of you, because I think that's what it was. I think ministry felt like it was, I think what I've said before is I feel like I died. Like I really felt like there was an old Colin and a new Colin. And that's, I'm now working on integrating and saying, all right, this is one person, not two. But just to give credence to that feeling that there is a version of you that can be happy and actually thriving in a different career than what you had before.
Oh man, thank you for sharing that. One last question. What does flourishing mean to you?
I would have said something different a long time ago. I think right now, flourishing looks like two things. One, that there's room for every single part of you to be included. It's what it looks like to flourish is to not be squishing out parts of yourself, but instead to give them a seat at your table. So whether you're angry or whether you have doubts or whether you have a dream you want to follow, like I think there's so much pressure, like so much of the pain in our lives comes from ignoring the thoughts and feelings and signals that our body's trying to give us. And I've noticed I've gotten healthier and felt more like I'm flourishing the less I've ignored it and the more I've just kind of welcomed those parts of me. I know that feels abstract and woo-woo, but I really do think that the more you can include those parts of you, the more you will actually feel like you're flourishing. And then on top of that is then just agency. So it all has a seat at the table. And I'm not saying then that you give all those different parts of you, you let them all run the show or give them equal weight. But it's that combination of saying, all right, it belongs. I'm not pushing this part out or pretending it's not there. But then I'm getting to make decisions that value and let the parts of me drive that I want to drive. And I'm able to do that and take my life in a direction. Like that combination of, all right, all of me is included. I'm not squishing anything out. And then agency of I'm then able to try to take steps to live the life of integrity that I want to live. To me, that's what flourishing feels like. I think at one point I would have had a much more spiritual answer to that. And now I guess
It sounds very spiritual to me.
It is in some ways. But I also hope that it feels rooted in reality. I think there's so much spirituality sometimes comes at the cost of reality. Like you have this vision of like, all right, here's what it means to relate to God or what purpose is. And if you're in the Christian world, like salvation, eternal life, all Holy Spirit, like you get all this language and it forces you to ignore sometimes like the very tangible things of like, oh, the pain I feel about this thing, the anger I have here, this desire I have for that over there. And it is spiritual to include those things, but I think a lot of spirituality actively excludes those things. And so for me, that's how I'm thinking about it differently.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. That's amazing. Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, man. Thank you.
For listeners who want to learn more about what you're up to, what you're doing, where can they connect with you and your work?
Yeah, so a couple different places. If you want to keep up with Holy Shift, you can follow us on Instagram at holyshift.pod or on LinkedIn. We're actually really active on LinkedIn. If you should look up Holy Shift, it'll come up. And then if you want to listen to the podcasts, we're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Just look up Holy Shift and it'll come up. White text, little squiggle behind it. We've got about 15 episodes so far of pastors and ministry leaders that we've interviewed.
Awesome, man. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate your insight and perspective, Colin. Thanks for having the conversation.
Likewise, Evan. Thanks for having me on.